It's so customary in Washington for members of both political parties. It's how the system works, and the members of the media, being integral parts of that system, want to do everything other than offer critiques of it.
There was a headline that grabbed my attention during the week. It said, wrote that the media stars in Washington almost never understand that there's anything wrong with the establishment of which they're part.
That's right. I mean, if you were to say to normal Americans, and it's the reason why these issues resonated and why Barack Obama made them a centerpiece of his campaign, that members of Congress leave office and make millions of dollars doing nothing other than essentially peddling influence to wealthy individuals who can have their way with Congress, most people consider that to be corruption. That's what Barack Obama called it when he ran. Yet to members of the media who have spent their lives in Washington, who are friends and colleagues of the people who are engorging themselves on this corrupt system, that is just the way of life. It's like breathing air or drinking water.
Well, what doesn't get considered, Bill, is that there could be anything radically wrong with Washington, that the entire institution could be broken, that there are new rules necessary. That idea that the institutions of Washington have failed and need to be changed doesn't really occur to the press because, as Glenn said, they're one of those institutions and they're one of the ones that failed. Because what the establishment expects is that people kind of say what they need to say to get elected, and then once they're in power, kind of the old rules of Washington reassert themselves.
You know, I think if you go back to the 1990s, what you saw is essentially a partnership between the Republican Party, the right wing, and establishment media venues. And this partnership was formed when they were essentially engaged in their lynch mob over the Lewinsky affair. And that partnership, those methods that were so successful then, translated into the media being blindly supportive and reverent of the Bush administration, and that partnership hasn't really gone anywhere.
My sense, Bill, is that insofar as politics looks like it always has, Obama's ratings will go down. So if Washington is able to kind of ensnare him in its usual game, if the kind of partisan bickering or argument resumes, if Washington seems to be behaving the way it always has, Obama will lose. And it's easy for that to happen. It's the most likely thing. And that might be what happened this week.
Yeah, let me just add to that, because I think it raises an interesting dilemma, which is, if you look at what the media were saying about Obama favorably, both around the time of his election and subsequent as well, they kept insisting that he would continue Bush's counterterrorism policies that were so controversial. They were praising him for leaving in place all sorts of Bush officials. What the media wants to see is continuity, that he's not threatening to their way of life and to their establishment for the reason that we talked about before. That's how he wins praise from them, is by showing that he isn't going to change things fundamentally and therefore isn't a threat to their system. At the same time, as Jay said, what he needs to do more than anything to fulfill the commitments that he made is demonstrate that he's a true change agent. And I think these objectives are very much in conflict, because the more he threatens the Washington system, I think the more hostility the press will feel towards him and therefore project to the public about him, and that too can undermine his political popularity.
You all are in the media and of the press, but so is Rush Limbaugh. I think you wrote on your blog that a Dave Brody from the Christian Broadcasting Network, Pat Robertson's outfit, will one Sunday show up on Meet the Press, but an Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Will never show up on Meet the Press. What's behind that phenomenon?
I think part of the reason is that if Amy Goodman came on Meet the Press, she would say all sorts of things that not only challenge the people on the program, but challenge what they had been saying over the years. Would go back and, in a sense, discredit the narrative that's been building up for a long time. People who would completely shatter that don't.
I think that's exactly right. It's all about the content of views. Rush Limbaugh can depict himself as being this insurgent outsider, but he supported the wars of the last 8 years. He supported the tax policies that Ronald Reagan essentially instituted as conventional wisdom, that we need to lower taxes, reduce government spending. All of the conventional cliches that the media airs frequently and doesn't need much time in order to explain are ones that Rush Limbaugh and the furthest fringes of the right essentially embrace. And so to include them into our discussions is not very disruptive at all. Whereas if you had people on from the left who were advocating things like the United States' responsibility for its unpopularity in the world, the fact that we wage wars and bomb other countries and invade and occupy other countries far more than any nation on the planet, to include somebody like that would not only threaten the vested interests of everybody who's participating in these conversations, it would disrupt the entire narrative. As Jay said, it would almost sound foreign, as though these views are unserious views, don't belong in mainstream serious shows, because these views are never heard. They're stigmatized, they're demonized as being things that don't really deserve a platform, and so you can't include advocates of these views in these shows.
You know what's really striking to me about this is Lawrence Wilkerson, who worked for Colin Powell, when he retired from the government, he said that the people in power, Cheney, Bush, and Rumsfeld especially, were, in his view, radicals. That the radicals were the people actually running the government. And this idea that the people in power were kind of outside the sphere of normal government never made its way into the establishment press at all.
I agree with Jay that it isn't so much that the media is liberal or conservative in terms of how those terms are defined conventionally in our political spectrum. What ends up happening is that ideas that are threatening to the media and to the political elites end up being attached to the label of liberalism or leftist ideology, with the corresponding orthodoxy that the one thing Obama, for instance, needs to show is that he's not beholden to the far left of his party, or that he's willing to scorn the leftists and the liberals in his party. That's when he generates the most praise. And the reason
from the
for
Washington
that,
Press Corps.
from the Washington Press Corps.
Right.
If you go back and look at the way in which Obama was praised for the last 2 months, almost entirely by the media, it will almost always be based on this idea that he's not an ideologue, that he's not in concert with the liberals and the leftists in his party. That's the greatest accomplishment in the eyes of the media a president could possibly aspire to. And the reason for that is because in their eyes, what liberalism or the leftist ideology is that they're scorning is not things about policy making per se, or even approaches to foreign policy. It's the idea that the prevailing consensus among our political elite is corrupted and needs to be radically changed. And so I think what they are most afraid of is having the anger of the American people start to affect what happens within their system. What they want more than anything else is exclude those external influences.
Will Washington ever get the message unless they feel the pulse of people who are saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore?
I think the idea of street demonstrations is probably the most stigmatized idea in our political process. There were huge marches, for instance, prior to the Iraq War.
Is it your sense that the situation in the country, with 500,000 people losing their jobs in a month, is it your sense that the reality in the country is far more calamitous than Washington seems to be perceiving it?
I think yes and no. I think that clearly the opinion-making elites and the political elites are generally insulated from the level of anxiety and economic threat that millions and millions of Americans are facing in the most extreme fashion since the Great Depression, as the cliche goes. At the same time, I think the problem is that the citizenry has really been trained to believe that they're impotent when it comes to demanding action from the political class. It's already extraordinary that 9 out of 10 Americans prior to the election, 9 out of 10, believe that the country was radically off course. So they've lost complete faith in our political institutions, our media institutions.
What if all those people out there who supported Obama through the internet actually used that technology to send him a message, wait a minute, this is going the wrong way, we expect more of you than this? What would happen?
I think that's one of the things that's going to happen if Obama is going to do anything other than essentially blend into the permanent political class in Washington. You actually saw a little bit of that when he first secured the nomination and then suddenly betrayed his commitment to filibuster any bill that contained telecom immunity. It created a real backlash among his supporters. His supporters, on whom he relies for his political power, are going to have to be the ones holding him accountable by being angry and dissatisfied when he seems to be off the course that he promised he would stay on.